The villa smelled faintly of salt and lemons, a mix of something clean and something fading. I tried to tell myself this was what we needed, time away from the noise, from work, from the slow exhaustion that had turned even our laughter mechanical. Daniel said this trip would fix that. He smiled when he said it, the same tired smile he gave every morning before logging into work. I didn't realize until later that he had invited someone else. His coworker. Evan. Daniel mentioned it casually while packing. He's been burned out too. Thought we could all use the break. I nodded, too practiced in not reacting. The thought of a third person joining didn't fit the picture I had built in my head, one of rediscovery, of quiet mornings just for us, but I said nothing. I didn't want to sound ungrateful for something meant to save us. When Evan arrived, his ease was unsettling. He fit in like he'd been here before, walking through the house as though he already knew where the glasses were kept. He and Daniel laughed easily, stories flowing between them with a rhythm I couldn't break into. I smiled when required, nodded when they glanced at me, and poured wine into glasses that weren't staying full long enough. Dinner was light and full of their shared jokes from the office. I listened and watched Daniel's face, animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. There was relief in seeing him happy, but it came with a sting. He looked more alive next to Evan than he had next to me in weeks. I told myself it was fine. Maybe this was good for him. Maybe this was how you fixed a marriage, by letting someone else remind your husband what joy sounded like. After dinner, I went out to the terrace. The ocean murmured beyond the cliffs, a sound that filled the gaps where conversation should have been. I wrapped my arms around myself, unsure if I was cold or simply aware of how alone I felt in that moment. When I turned, Evan was at the doorway, holding another glass. "You disappeared," he said softly. I smiled faintly. "Just needed air." He joined me without asking. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, which made it dangerous. He didn't look at me long, but when he did, it was like he was reading something I hadn't meant to leave open. He spoke about work, about Daniel's determination, about how everyone admired his focus. I listened. His voice was calm, unhurried. He said things in a way that made them sound like they mattered. When Daniel spoke, I often felt small in the spaces between his sentences. With Evan, the spaces seemed to hold me instead. When Daniel called from inside, Evan handed me the glass and left. It was nothing, a shared moment between two polite people. But when I went to bed, I kept replaying his voice, the steady tone of it. Daniel was beside me, already half asleep, his breathing uneven, his phone face down on the nightstand. I stared at the ceiling, wondering when comfort had started feeling so empty. The next morning, breakfast was simple. Daniel was distracted, talking about emails even though he had promised not to. Evan made coffee, humming faintly to himself, and asked me if I wanted sugar before I even reached for it. It was such a small thing, knowing without asking, but it landed harder than it should have. I told myself not to make anything of it. People noticed details. That's all. We spent the day exploring the small town nearby. Daniel led the way, his camera out, capturing things he'd never look at again. Evan and I walked behind, a half step slower. Every now and then, he'd comment quietly about something, an old couple sitting by the pier, the way the sunlight broke against the water, and I'd find myself responding more honestly than I intended. He listened like he meant to remember it. Lunch, Daniel got a work call and excused himself, leaving his food untouched. Evan glanced at me, almost apologetic for Daniel's absence, though he hadn't caused it. We talked while waiting, our words slower, heavier. There was no flirting, just an understanding that didn't belong there. When Daniel returned, I felt the world snap back into place, but not perfectly. Something small had shifted. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I went to the window. The air smelled like salt and rain. I thought about how easy it was to be invisible when someone had already decided what they wanted to see. Evan hadn't done anything wrong, and neither had I. But the distance between what we hadn't said was already filling with meaning. I heard Daniel mumble in his sleep, something about deadlines, and turned back toward him. His face was peaceful, almost boyish. I wanted to reach out, to remind myself that I still knew this man, but the impulse faded halfway. I lay there, eyes open, feeling the faint hum of the ocean through the walls, and realized that sometimes betrayal doesn't start with a touch. It begins when someone finally looks at you like you're still there. That was the first night I dreamt of silence, not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that waits for something to happen. And in that silence, I felt the beginning of something I couldn't name yet, only that it was already too late to pretend nothing had changed. The next morning began with the same careful rhythm, yet something in me was shifting. I moved through the house with practiced ease, but my thoughts kept circling back to the quiet space between Arman and me. I wanted to believe the silence would mend itself, that we only needed rest, but the emptiness pressed heavier each day. At work, Zoya handed me a coffee with a knowing smile. She asked if I had been sleeping, and I shrugged, offering a safe half-truth. During lunch she mentioned her brother Omar, who had just started helping with a project in our department. Later, when I met him briefly, he greeted me with warmth that felt effortless. His questions were simple, about my work, my ideas, and yet I felt oddly visible, as though someone had turned on a light I hadn't realized was dim. Over the following week, our paths crossed often. Sometimes Omar sent short messages about tasks, but they grew into little exchanges about books and music. I told myself they were harmless, only words filling an otherwise dull afternoon. Still, I caught myself checking my phone with an eagerness I couldn't explain. Each notification steadied something inside me, a reminder that I could still spark curiosity in another person. Evenings at home became quieter. Arman, tired from meetings, collapsed into the couch while I hovered near, unsure how to breach the calm that felt too brittle to disturb. I wanted to tell him about the small things that had brightened my day, but his focus stayed on the screen or drifting thoughts. I reminded myself that marriage required patience, yet a restless pulse in me kept whispering that I was fading behind his gaze. One night, after Sami fell asleep, I lingered over an unanswered message from Omar. He had asked about a poem I once mentioned, wanting to know why it mattered to me. The question was ordinary, but it carried a gentleness that made me pause. I typed a reply, then erased it, then wrote again, choosing words carefully, aware that a line was close though I couldn't quite name it. The next day, I caught my reflection in a shop window, phone in hand, smiling at a text. For a moment I didn't recognize the expression, lighter, almost shy. The realization unsettled me. I wasn't searching for romance, yet attention had become its own quiet pull, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. That evening, I sat beside Arman at dinner, listening to him describe a colleague's promotion. I nodded at the right places, but my thoughts wandered. I wanted him to ask about me, to notice the small shadows beneath my eyes or the way I hesitated before speaking. He didn't. I felt an ache that wasn't anger, more like an old bruise touched again. Later, in the solitude of our bedroom, I scrolled through Omar's latest message. He had sent a photo of a sunrise from his commute, writing that it reminded him of a conversation we'd had about beginnings. It was innocent, yet the intimacy of sharing something meant only for me stirred conflicting emotions. I set the phone aside, heart unsettled, unsure whether to answer or retreat. Sleep came slowly. I lay there measuring the weight of loyalty, wondering how fragile a marriage could become without a single argument or betrayal. Perhaps it wasn't one grand choice but a series of tiny hesitations, glances, and omissions that shaped distance. I thought of Sami's laughter, of the home we had built, of the man sleeping a few inches away. I knew I didn't want to lose any of it. Still, I couldn't deny the part of me that craved to feel alive again, to be heard without asking. The next morning, Omar greeted me with casual warmth, and I felt my pulse quicken despite myself. I told him about a book Sami loved, steering the conversation toward safe ground, yet the undercurrent remained. On the way home I resolved to draw a clear boundary, to protect what truly mattered. But resolve faltered when I imagined another evening wrapped in the same unspoken distance. That night, As Armand prepared for bed, I studied his face, searching for an opening. I wanted to tell him that I missed us, that I needed more than quiet companionship. The words stayed locked inside, waiting for a courage I hadn't yet found. I switched off the lamp and lay still, listening to his steady breathing while my own thoughts churned. A part of me longed to reach across the gap and anchor myself to him again. Another part hovered at the edge of temptation, unsure how to step back without leaving pieces of myself behind. The morning felt different, though nothing in the house had changed. Armand's gaze lingered when I handed him his tea, quiet but steady, as if he were finally looking past the surface. My pulse quickened. I sensed he had caught a fragment of the storm I tried to hide. For a moment I thought about slipping into routine, but something inside told me the time for silence had ended. When Sammy left for school, the house fell into an uneasy calm. Armand remained at the table, fingers tracing the rim of his cup. He asked if I was all right, his voice low, almost tentative. The question unsettled me because it sounded genuine, not the polite inquiry we usually traded. I hesitated, torn between the safety of a practiced smile and the risk of honesty. Words spilled before I could stop them. I told him how lonely I had felt, how our conversations had thinned until they were only about errands and responsibilities. I admitted that someone else had noticed me, that I had let the attention fill a hollow space I didn't know how to share with him. My voice trembled, not from guilt alone but from fear of losing what still mattered most. Armand's shoulders stiffened. For a heartbeat I expected anger, maybe cold withdrawal. Instead, he stayed quiet, eyes fixed on me with a weight I hadn't felt in years. He said he had sensed me pulling away but didn't know how to reach across the distance. Work, exhaustion, his own worries, he had let them blur the edges of us without realizing the cost. We sat in the stillness that followed, the truth heavy yet strangely clarifying. For the first time in months, we were fully present with each other, stripped of the polite masks we had worn. I felt tears sting, not from shame alone but from the fragile relief of finally being seen. He asked if I wanted to leave. The question startled me. I shook my head, unsure if I had spoken or only moved. I didn't want escape, I wanted to rebuild, to feel again the steady warmth that had once drawn us together. He reached across the table, his hand tentative. When his fingers brushed mine, something inside loosened, a quiet reminder of the bond we had almost let slip away. The rest of the day moved gently, as if the world was giving us room to breathe. We spoke in fragments, about Sammy, about work, about how easily life had swallowed our attention. Each word carried the effort of people trying to learn one another again. There were no grand promises, only small acknowledgments of where we had failed and where we wanted to begin. That evening, as I watched Sammy building towers from his toy blocks, I felt a steadier calm settle over me. The temptation that had once glimmered bright now seemed pale beside the choice to stay and fight for what we had built. I understood that loyalty was not just the absence of betrayal but the willingness to return, to repair, even after missteps threatened the foundation. When the house grew quiet, Armand joined me by the window. He didn't offer sweeping apologies or demands. Instead, he spoke about the night we first met, how he had admired my laughter, how he still wanted to understand the person behind it. His words weren't perfect, yet they held a sincerity that reached me more than anything else could. I told him I wanted us to be braver with each other, to speak before silence grew thick. He agreed, promising not certainty but effort. For once, that felt like enough. Later, lying beside him, I thought about the fragile strength of trust. It isn't an unbreakable wall but a bridge we choose to walk together, even after cracks appear. I felt his hand slide toward mine in the dark, fingers intertwining with quiet steadiness. Sleep came with a gentler rhythm. I knew the path ahead wouldn't be smooth, yet hope pulsed faintly beneath the scars. The memory of Omar's attention no longer held the same glow. It had been a mirror showing me what I was missing, not the answer to it. What mattered was the man beside me, the child sleeping down the hall, and the life we still had a chance to shape. That I closed my eyes with a quiet certainty. Being truly seen begins with daring to reveal yourself, even when the cost is high. And sometimes the person you feared losing is waiting, ready to meet you halfway once you let the truth breathe between you. Daniel's new version of peace looked a lot like denial. He'd wake early, make coffee, kiss my shoulder, and move through his routine with a lightness that didn't belong to the same man who once worked until midnight. He talked more, laughed more, but always about safe things: weather, work promotions, weekend plans. It was as though the air between us had been cleaned, the traces of something unspoken carefully erased. I played along, letting him believe that silence could heal what honesty would only destroy. Months had passed since the vacation, and Evan's name was now something that floated quietly around the edges of conversation, never landing, never forgotten. He sent Daniel the occasional work message. I'd hear his name mentioned briefly and feel a ripple beneath the calm. I'd smile where I was supposed to, nod when expected. Daniel noticed none of it, or maybe he chose not to. Either way, we existed in the kind of peace that requires pretending not to remember. That I thought the guilt would fade, but it didn't. It changed form. It became smaller, sharper, hiding in moments, his hand brushing mine at breakfast, his voice calling from the next room. Each reminder was both comfort and punishment. The worst part wasn't the secret, it was realizing how easy it was to live with one. I had become a version of myself that functioned flawlessly, cooking, smiling, answering kindly, but everything beneath the surface stayed locked and restless. Daniel planned another trip, somewhere different this time. A quiet countryside lodge. He said it would be good to disconnect again, just us, no interruptions. I agreed, but a part of me knew he was chasing a ghost version of what we'd already lost. You can't recreate something once you've seen the fracture. You can only decorate the crack. The lodge was peaceful, the air heavy with pine and stillness. He looked at me across the table and said he was proud of us, proud that we'd found our way back. I wanted to tell him we hadn't. We just learned to walk around what we broke. But instead, I smiled and said, I'm proud too. The lie didn't even sting anymore. It fit like something well practiced. That night, he held me like he was trying to anchor something that had already drifted. I let him, but my thoughts were elsewhere, not with Evan, not exactly, but with the version of myself that had existed before him. The woman who still believed love could be repaired if you worked hard enough. That version was gone, replaced by someone who understood that betrayal doesn't always demand an act, it can live quietly in longing, in silence, in the way you stop needing someone's touch but can't admit it. Days turned into a routine again. Daniel thrived at work, his name being mentioned in meetings, promotions, success stories. I watched him from across dinner tables and wondered if he ever sensed how far apart we'd drifted. If he did, he never said. Sometimes he'd reach for my hand mid-conversation, absent-mindedly, like memory guiding him more than desire. I'd hold his hand back out of reflex, and for a second, it almost felt real. Then the stillness would return. One evening, as I was clearing the table, I saw a message flash on Daniel's phone, Evan's name, short text, "Thanks for covering earlier. Hope you both are well." Nothing suspicious. Just enough to make my chest tighten. I read it twice, not for meaning but for memory. That name had power it shouldn't have. I set the phone back where I found it and carried on as if nothing stirred inside me. Later, lying in bed, Daniel's arm around me, I thought about how we were both haunted by the same man for different reasons. Daniel, by friendship, me, by the quiet ruin of what almost was. Weeks later, Evan reached out directly. A single line in my inbox under a subject with no name. Does it ever stop feeling like it's still happening? I stared at it for a long time, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. I didn't reply. Deleting it felt impossible, so I moved it to drafts, where it sat like an echo of everything unsaid. I checked it again days later, reread it until the words lost meaning. When I finally deleted it, I didn't feel lighter, just emptier. Daniel started talking about the future again, maybe buying a second house, maybe starting fresh somewhere quieter. I listened, nodding, my mind elsewhere. It wasn't that I didn't love him. I did, in the way you love something that has become part of your routine. But the love was hollow, stripped of wonder. The kind that survives not because it's alive but because it's convenient. One morning, he asked if I was happy. The question came suddenly, almost tenderly. I paused too long before answering. "Of course," I said finally, forcing the smile. He studied my face for a moment and then nodded as if he believed it, or needed to. When he left for work, I stood by the window, watching him go, realizing how strange it was to live beside someone who once knew every version of you and now only recognized the outline. That night, alone in the dark, I thought of Evan again, not the man, but the silence he left behind. The space he'd occupied wasn't about desire anymore, it was about awareness. He had seen through me, and once someone does, it's impossible to unfeel it. He was gone, but the clarity he left remained, a truth I could never say aloud. Sometimes infidelity isn't about leaving someone. It's about realizing you already have. Daniel came home late, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "You're my peace." I smiled, whispered it back, and watched him drift to sleep beside me. The moonlight hit his face softly, and I thought about how love can survive even when it's no longer alive, how two people can share a bed but sleep in separate worlds. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything we'd buried beneath quiet gestures and gentle lies. Somewhere deep down, I knew this was the real ending, not loud, not cruel, just inevitable. The kind that doesn't shatter, it fades. And as the night stretched on, the truth settled inside me with terrifying calm. He would never know the whole story, and I would never tell it. Some things are too quiet to confess, too final to undo.